Thank you very much.
What is the Seizure power?
On the 30th of January, what has gone down in German history as the so-called seizure of power is once again commemorated. And of course, if one is honest, it was not a seizure of power, but a constitutional transfer of power by President Hindenburg to Adolf Hitler, who was, however, framed in a coalition. This is always forgotten when one sees the image of the Hitler government. There are exactly 3 from the National Socialist Party involved, namely Adolf Hitler, then Wilhelm Frick as Interior Minister, and Hermann Göring as Minister without portfolio. This was also due to the fact that in November 1932, at the last Reichstag election, the National Sozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei had received 33%, if I'm not mistaken. 33.1, 33.2 in that direction. That means one has to ask how it even came to this. It didn't just fall from the sky, but it's a development that can be traced not just over 10 years, but over 100 years. And that is the topic of the current video. How did the so-called seizure of power come about on the 30th? January 1933 by the National Socialists, where my view, you will see it soon, goes back very far. How did it come about in the context of a coalition to the so-called seizure of power by the National Socialists on the 30th of January 1933? Well, to answer this question, one must not stand like a rabbit in front of a snake, but must include in his considerations, especially the neighbors of Germany and the political, social situation of the past 2 centuries. And importantly, don't believe everything you can read about it on the internet or in thick history books. Because often included in it is the historical falsification due to the omnipotent propaganda, where only certain stones are always broken out of the German mosaic of the past 200 years, to then show them around with relish. Especially the nations that like to point at Germany, from Russia to Poland to France, from Great Britain and the United States of America, have not only fought significantly more wars in their past than Prussia-Germany, but have also acted highly imperialistic in both word and deed. Of course, I do not want to distract from partial or main responsibilities for what happened in or through Germany, or to gloss over anything. But if, as the great military scientist Karl von Clausewitz said, wars were seen until 1914 as merely the continuation of politics by other means, then since then the propaganda during and after the First World War, whether from France but especially from Great Britain, has caused a great deal of confusion. No method, no matter how perfidious, was left untried at that time to discredit Germany in the eyes of the world, which was seen as truth by millions in the media poor era. Believe me, with such frequently originating from the lowest drawer of lies, one can condemn the imperial and colonial politics of most European countries, and not least also those of the superpowers in the East and West. As for the path to the authoritarian leader state, as it had taken place in Europe about 100 years ago, everything had started with the rise of nihilism, as the denial of the validity of any being, knowledge value, and social orders is called, and the decay of the feudal civil peasant world. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche called it the revaluation of values. When it then came to the proletarianization of the masses, neither the monarchies nor the church had an answer to it and failed once again. Around 1850 then followed the transition into the industrial age and the late bloom of imperialism, as one calls the endeavor of a state to gain political and economic influence in other countries, including the absolute. After the realization had largely prevailed in the 19th century that humans are the most highly developed predator, a kind of super predator which leaves a trail of devastation wherever it appears, the counter-movement began in the late 19th century in the form of the art movement of French and German symbolism, with its significant representatives, the French lyricist Arthur Rimbaud and the German lyricist Stéphane Georges. From this developed Art Nouveau, with its many variants going in many directions, which can be regarded as the last common European style. But then it also began to simmer in the youth-seeking community. Then a tremendous restlessness seized the masses, an inner hopelessness, a mood of departure into the great adventure, out of the bourgeoisie and satiety. As the only 37-year-old Ribot had sung, I dread the wall that strangles Europe. Friedrich Nietzsche, the relentless seismograph, had predicted the final development, almost as an inescapable fate. Then came the First World War, into which one slid with varying degrees of guilt. This, also known as the First Technical War, with its automatic alliances and the hubris of war goals, shaped the concept of what I want to call the World Revolution. Believers and enthusiasts, hopeful, filled with utopias, had gone into the First World War, so only uprooted, desperate, and disappointed were left over. As for the war conduct of all nations involved at that time, it was the most regressive of all previous wars in military, intellectual, and economic terms. Finally, material was pitted against material. The war was won by whoever could deploy the most material. But a new type of warrior had also emerged in all European armies. In the steel storms, as the German infantry officer and later writer Ernst Jünger, who was awarded the Pula Merit, had called the major battle days in his bestseller. But once again, the political and military powers had shown their inability to recognize. Then in November 18 in Germany, there had been an unnecessary and failed revolution, during which the moderate social democrat Friedrich Ebert, who had lost 2 sons in the war, lost to the rather agile Philipp Scheidemann, who constantly adapted to the political currents. Due to his pushing forward, instead of a constitutional monarchy preferred by Ebert, a republic unloved from the first day was created. How could it have been any different with the spontaneous founding of the republic and its irreparable break with tradition? After all, the German Empire, founded in 1871, consisted of the kingdoms of Prussia, Saxony, Bavaria, and Württemberg, and many grand duchies and principalities with centuries-old traditions, which had now been replaced by a party landscape tearing each other apart, with some dubious figures at their head. When radical leftists repeatedly tried to establish Soviet-style council republics in the German states, monarchist-minded Freikorps saved the republic, another ironic twist in the certainly not poor German history. Then it happened on the 28th June 1919, on the day of the 5-year recurrence of the assassination attempt on the Austrian heir to the throne couple in Sarajevo, exactly where, 48 years earlier, on the 18th January 1871, the German Empire had been christened to the Treaty of Versailles. And to increase the disgrace towards Germany even more, the non-negotiable content had been presented to the German delegation on the 7th. May 1919 was handed over, exactly 4 years, to the day after the sinking of the Lusitania, which was also loaded with weapons and explosives. The Treaty of Versailles was a stupid, petty, and vengeful treaty, in which there is even a clause enforced by France that the crosses on German war graves in France must be black, as a symbol of disgrace, in contrast to the almost innocent white of all other warring nations. In addition, the treaty was economically impossible to fulfill. In the articles of this treaty, mainly dictated by France or the German hater Raymond Poincaré, lies the root of much of what happened until 1933. not only in Germany. Here, however, the leveling of the bourgeoisie and the concentration of capital intensified. The much-praised golden 20s, as seen by the painter Otto Dix, were in reality only truly golden for a very small group, mainly consisting of the clientele that had earned the most from the war and during the course of the revolution. What came after the Treaty of Versailles were reparations in the billions. The beginning of 1923, the French occupation of the Ruhr, with the half-hearted struggle for the Ruhr, led by Germany, and the complete collapse of the German currency. In November 1923, due to hyperinflation, a loaf of bread cost 100 billion marks, and a dollar was worth 4.2 trillion marks. Then, as if out of nowhere, demagogic politicians like the National Socialist Adolf Hitler or the communist Ernst Thälmann appeared, who moved the masses with the unimaginative simplification of their demands. These were supported by an until then hardly imaginable unemployment of almost 6 million at the end. One government replaced the other. In the end, only the disappointed remained. Disappointed soldiers who felt cheated of the price of their sacrifice in the war. Disappointed monarchists who switched from the old to the ancient, that is, from Wilhelm II to Frederick the Great. Disappointed citizens who mourned their possessions in times of glory. Disappointed republicans who had imagined a German republic quite differently. Disappointed workers, disappointed socialists, disappointed farmers, and disappointed petty nobility who saw the, quote, spirit of the city breaking into their security. Disappointed Christians and non-Christians, and finally the disappointed intelligentsia, none of whose utopias had been fulfilled. The result was the formation of the primal currents that keep appearing in our existence, from which ultimately 4 disastrous alliances remained. The restorative nationalism with partly good names, the revolutionary nationalism, whose boundaries to socialism were fluid, the moderate semi-bourgeois socialism of the trade unions, and the communism of large parts of the working class oriented towards Lenin. With the dramatic weakening of the religious element, also due to war and post-war experiences, all these formations now embrace the belief in power and success and promised redemption. In this, National Socialism was the most demagogic. It started with the simplest slogans and worked with modern means of mass influence, against which the Weimar Republic stood hopelessly in defense. All these processes deprived the rest of the bourgeois class, which originated from the liberal conservative milieu, of their secured possessions. More and more civil servants, officials, and employees with meager salaries, more and more semi-proletariat, strengthened the pull towards the radical wings. Their weapon was initially the ballot, but then the example of other dictatorships also had a contagious effect. Because the seductive totalitarianism was in no way limited to Germany alone. In Russia, the dictator Stalin had been in power since 1927. In Poland, the dictatorially ruling Joseph Pilsudski had already been in power a year earlier. Austria had the Austro-fascist Engelbert Dollfuss as chancellor. In Spain, the fascists under General Primo de Rivera ruled from 1923, and in Italy since 1925, the fascist Duce, the leader Benito Mussolini. Whether in Turkey under Field Marshal Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, in the Kingdom of Hungary under Admiral Miklos Horthy, the Czech semi-dictator Edward Banez, or Antonio de Oliveira Salazar in Portugal, all these names stand for an authoritarian regime. Over all the same attempts to overthrow the crumbling order, or to create a suspected order, with which the final phase of the great world destruction began, and the great liquidators of our history, the great destroyers in and outside of Europe, got free rein for the apocalypse. From 1932 to 1933, last attempts were made in Germany to halt the development through conservative liberal governments, as here through the cabinet of Franz von Papen and up to the 30th January, 1933, last presidential cabinet under the former general corps of Schleicher. But it was too late. All responsible politicians lacked inner strength and the courage to be unpopular. They had lost contact with the voters and had become faithless. Thus, the leaderless, unemployed, godless masses, caught up in substitute religions, ran amok, still believing in ideals that can be realized by organizations of leaders to the leader, second only to National Socialism. The consequences of the victors' actions with the Treaty of Versailles were now haunting them. So, it simply has to be a leader. After Kaiser Wilhelm II Reich's president, Friedrich Ebert, of the Social Democratic Party of Germany, retired Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, all democratic governments, and even the communist Ernst Thälmann had failed, the European development towards a fascist leader state was now also being replicated in Germany. In the age of optics and acoustics, Hitler used the very skilled use of the most modern means of mass influence for his politics. He brought all currents and directions. He brought nationalism, socialism, anti-Semitism, the individual's fear of freedom to a primitive, even vulgar formula. From the 30th of January 1933, he lured the German people into the cage of power. The people expected work, justice, and honor. What they got is known to him.